Hi, I'm Sue. This is my boss, Kate Leigh, who has kindly agreed to pose the questions. And thanks to Nate Salo, who's behind the camera. So we'll just go on and go with the 6 questions that were sent.
What is your current position, job title, and place?
I am currently Cataloging and Metadata Services Librarian, music emphasis, at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.
Is this the same or different position at the time of your first involvement with MOUG?
It's a different position. My first professional position was at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas as the Music and Media Cataloger. I landed there in February of 1986, which is about when MOUG was having its meeting for that year. So I began attending MOUG the next year in 1987 and have been going pretty much ever since.
What have been your first MOUG activities and involvement?
It didn't really take very long. I'd only been going to MOUG for a couple of years. They probably smelled fresh meat. When I was asked to be on, of all things, a reference task force on Search CD 450. OCLC was doing this initiative to release discrete segments of WorldCat, which was then called the Online Union Catalog, or the OLUC, on CD-ROM. And the idea, I think, was that especially smaller places might want to copy catalog from it, and you could also use it as a reference and what we would now call discovery tool for JoQ Public. And they decided to do one on recordings, all of the audio recordings that were in the OLUC at the time, and release this on CD-ROM. And got the bright idea that maybe they should talk to the music librarians and see what they wanted to have on it and what should be indexed and so on, which was a good thing because some of the suggestions they had were a little silly. Anyway, I was on this task force, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and we got together. BitNet was at its beginning, so we actually could communicate electronically, and come up with what we wanted indexed and how we wanted it to be displayed and so on. And that was a good thing. We had a high degree of consensus. Search CD 450, however, never really took off. They tried it for a few years, but it never really did too much. So I'm not sure how much impact it had, but it did give me some good experience. A couple of years after that, in 1991, I managed to get elected as secretary and newsletter editor. That's a 2-year term, so I did my 2 years and got out all the newsletters. As a result, I was on the board. I was officially on the MOUG board. And so I was involved in their planning and policy decisions and that sort of thing. I remember that 2 of the people that I was on the board with were Laura Snyder and Jennifer Bowen, both of whom at the time were at the Sibley Music Library. As a result of being a board member, I was automatically on the nominations committee as my term ended. And so I was in charge of rustling up other people to serve in my position and other open slots that year. Sometime later, Ralph Papakian named me chair of the Prism Review Task Force. Raise your hand if you've never heard of Prism. This was an interface from some time ago. And by this time, we really did have internet access. And so we emailed the membership and saying, what don't you like about Prism? What would you like to see? Don't complain to your dog, complain to me. And, what functionality people wanted to see. Got a pretty good response for that. So we put it together and gave it to OCLC. And they did implement some of it, eventually, slowly. One piece of it, I remember, they really could not implement until the platform underlying connection was developed. And I remember when Linda Gable from OCLC announced that you now had this capability, and I wrote her and said, blast from the past. That was a suggestion we had like 10 years ago. But those 3 are the 3 official things that I was involved with. I would like to point out, however, that you don't have to be a board officer or a member of a committee or a task force to be involved in MOUG. It is small enough that you get to know your colleagues really well. You just have more opportunity to talk to people, and pretty much everyone can participate. There's also more open-ended discussions. For several years, MOUG has had something called Ask MOUG, whatever's on your mind, and you can just pose any kind of question at all. And so I've always found that to be useful. My own personal, continuing low-level involvement has been as an icebreaker. There's a presentation by somebody, and then there's time for questions. And I always wait to see if somebody has a question. If nobody does, then I start the ball rolling, because I nearly always have a question. And so, that's, I guess, maybe valuable.
All right. Who or what drew you to MOUG?
I don't remember specifically. It might have been my supervisor at Wichita State. My predecessor probably had gone, and she would have suggested that I go as well. If not that, then the library at Wichita State, as at Ball State, was an institutional member of MOUG. And that means you got the newsletter. And so that newsletter would have been routed to me, and so I would have found out about it there. And I was a music librarian, and I was an OCLC user, and then I saw that MOUG met just prior to MLA in the same place. What a deal. Especially when I lived in Wichita, and almost nothing was within driving distance. So that was, 2 for 1 was always valuable to me.
What changes have you seen in MOUG over the years?
One change, I think, is that administratively it has grown up a little bit out of its teenage years. The board did the work necessary to get MOUG certified as an organization to which you can make donations, and then be able to deduct those donations on your taxes, at least so far. Another thing that happened is we changed the bylaws to have a extra treasurer, to have a treasurer-elect as well as a treasurer, and then, depending on the year, a treasurer and a past treasurer, to have an overlap of the treasurer position, because the finances got complicated enough that it was useful to have that overlap. And it just seems that if something comes up, there's a way to deal with it, whereas in the earlier years, it was a little bit more ad hoc. So that's one change. A second thing is that MOUG was originally for music catalogers. That's because OCLC was invented for the people who worked in ILL and for the catalogers. And so for a long time, that was what MOUG did. And as OCLC began to recognize the further use of the database it managed for citation verification and reference and JOQ public to do what we would today call discovery. See the aforementioned reference task force for Search CD 450. That was one of their early. Anyway, MOUG would respond just like they did for that task force, and eventually MOUG named a reference services coordinator. And there would be these, occasionally there would be something big happening, and that person would be really busy, and then it would sort of fall off. It kind of progressed in fits and starts. And what I've seen now is a more continuous interest in the public services things. One thing that was good is they made the reference services coordinator a member of the board, instead of just somebody out there who would report every now and then if there was something interesting happening. So the last few years, there's been much more, we hear much more about the public services things. There's more programming in that area, in the conferences. And I look forward to the time when everyone sees MOUG as a organization for music librarians and not for music catalogers.
What is your favorite MOUG memory?
If I may be indulged with two of them. One was we were celebrating, MOUG was celebrating an earlier anniversary. I don't remember which one. And Judy Wiedow, at the time, was the music cataloger at the University of Texas at Austin. And she gave this talk about, things that had changed or things that weren't present when MOUG was founded but were now there. And it was all sort of these in-group jokes. And she said, how many people were members of LS 2000? Raise your hand if you've never heard of LS 2000. This was OCLC's foray into being a provider of an integrated library system. And it turned out they weren't really set up to do all of the modules very well. But, they did try, and a number of people chose them as their ILS vendor. But as I say, it was somewhat ill-fated, and they did close up shop as people began to go to other places. And anyway, she said, how many people here were LS 2000 members? And a few people tentatively raised their hands. And from some corner, Jay White yelled, come on, fess up! And everybody's laughed, and a number of other hands went up. Another thing Judy mentioned was, do you remember life before the completion of the Telemon thematic catalog? And the place just exploded in laughter. Until that thematic catalog was published, and it had just recently been completed at the time, there was no way to tell which of Telemon's, say, sonatas for two violins and continuo in G major you were talking about, because he wrote several. Mm-hmm. And this was true of lots of things. So it was just, I just remember that talk she gave as being something that would make sense to everybody in the room, but probably not much of anybody else. Another memory I have, favorite memory, is fairly recent. The Library of Congress medium of performance terms had become available. And people on the staff side, the catalogers, had been coding them, at least a lot of us, for about a year. But it's fairly arcane coding, lots of subfields and stuff. And now it was time to figure out how to display all this cool information we'd coded in a way that was intelligible to the average user, or at least to music librarians on the public side. And so there was a session where sort of everybody just got together and had a discussion about how to do this, a very freewheeling discussion about how to approach this. And it was nearly everybody participated. We're talking probably 80 people. And it was like a human pinball machine. People were pinging and ricocheting ideas off each other and arguing points and coming to a consensus. And I remember thinking, this is what makes MOUG work. And so that's another favorite memory of the past.
Wonderful. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.